Please take care. This podcast contains strong language and discussions of homophobia, transphobia, violence, and trauma. It contains the voices of people who have passed. Rā tau kua whetū rangitia. It also contains tales of joy, triumph, and resilience. Rights and Realities, Remembering 1986. Brought to you by Te Kāhui Tika Tangata Human Rights Commission. 2026 marks 40 years since the Homosexual Law Reform Act passed, the moment that sex between consenting men was finally decriminalised in Aotearoa New Zealand and a major step towards equality was taken. In this podcast, leaders from our rainbow communities guide us through the changing story of sexuality and gender, revisit the moments that shaped a landmark bill, reflect on the Human Rights Commission's role, and honour the courage of those who fought on the front lines for equality. Episode 2. The Campaign. From the 1960s onward, small but growing movements began pushing for reform of the criminalisation of homosexuality. Groups like the Dorian Society, Gay Liberation Front, and later the National Gay Rights Coalition spoke out against unfair laws and treatment. International events such as the 1957 Wolfenden Report in the UK and the 1969 Stonewall riots in the US had ripple effects that reached all the way to Aotearoa. The early 70s saw a significant groundswell of support after lesbian academic Ngāhuia Te Awe Kōtuku was denied a permit to visit the USA on the grounds that she was homosexual. Early attempts at reform had failed. The first in 1974 under National MP Gavin Young, and a second in 1979 by Labour's Warren Frere. Then came the turning point, and at its centre, Labour MP Fran Wilde, who introduced a bill that would transform lives, the Homosexual Law Reform Bill. It would also plunge the country into a heated and deeply emotional debate. Supporters campaigned for fairness and human rights, while opponents organised a nationwide petition to keep homosexual activity criminalised. People like National Party MP Norman Jones heard here at the Wellington Town Hall in 1985.
You're back into the sewers! You're back into the sewers where you come from! As far as I'm concerned, you can stay in the gutter! Let all the normal people stand up! We do not want homosexuality legalised! We do not want our children to be contaminated by those. Turn around and look at them. Turn around and look at them. Look at them. Gaze upon them. You're looking into Hades. You're looking at the homosexuals. Don't look too long. You might catch AIDS. All right. Thank you very much.
In this episode, activists Linda Evans and Gavin Young, who were there on the front lines, discuss those early attempts at law reform, the internal politics of rainbow communities, international influences, and what it took to stand up to the opposing hatred. And they ask, what did we learn?
Kia ora, Gavin.
Kia ora, Linda.
What do you think is the importance of the 40th anniversary of the passing of Fran Wilde's Homosexual Law Reform Bill?
I think the lives of our communities have really been transformed since the law reform passed in 1986. And the other thing, it demonstrated to parliamentarians that they could actually fix the laws against our communities without electoral consequences, because nobody lost their seats as a result of it in the 1987 election, which was the one that followed. I think also that knowing our history and how we got to Fran Wilde's bill is equally vital for today and as we look forward into what may come next, because history can revert, and it can revert quite quickly. Fran will tell you that her bill didn't magic up out of nowhere, but it was a culmination of work by many people in the 1960s, 70s and 80s when getting law reform was quite difficult. And in the early years, there was an expectation that we wouldn't get to an age of consent of 16 in one go. That was virtually unimaginable.
I agree, Gavin, and I think we had to use all of those experience and those skills that we had developed in the organising of the 60s, 70s and 80s in order to get the bill passed in 85, 86. But do you want to start by talking about the legal situation of gay men before reform?
Yeah, I mean, if we go back to the 1950s, and Britain was very important to New Zealand still at that stage, but the British government set up an inquiry into homosexuality and prostitution. It was known as the Wolfenden Committee, headed by John Wolfenden, and it reported in 1957 with a recommendation to decriminalise sex between men in England and Wales to an age consent of 21. But actually, the more enduring legacy has been that they actually went through a number of the myths and arguments against homosexuals and against homosexual law reform, and they basically debunked them. And so some of those, and I won't go through them all, but that homosexual men were mentally ill, that homosexual men were child molesters, that people became homosexual through seduction. So what the committee did was they gathered a lot of evidence and then they rejected the myths. So the result of that is in New Zealand, we then got a report which was a contemporary official document that we could use in submissions to Parliament and other bodies. And also it was used in courts as well when people were being prosecuted. Now, the Crimes Act was the law that contained the sections prohibiting sex between men, and it was updated in 1961 where it reconfirmed sex between men was a crime. And this also, interestingly, covered transvestites and drag queens, which is not often appreciated, and many of whom would have dressed as women, but they had sex with men, and therefore they were covered by the law. But it was quite a repressive time for our communities back in the 50s and the 60s. And, prison really destroyed people's lives. It also destroyed careers and it brought shame on themselves and their whānau, including Maori who got caught up in the system. Even a fine or probation usually got people's names mentioned in the newspapers, and that caused a lot of humiliation and shame and could have wider implications, particularly if people were married with kids. And the police themselves, they would call up employers even before there was a conviction just to let them know what was going on. And even that could result in job losses. But I think probably the most insidious consequence of the law was blackmail. And we don't see much of it these days, but it happened a lot in the past, or quite frequently. There was a doctor in Whangarei in the late 1950s who took a man home, and that man subsequently blackmailed him by threatening to expose him. And the doctor paid up. He paid thousands and thousands of pounds, and that's a lot of money in today's terms. And he could see no way out. The blackmailer just kept asking for more. So if he had been exposed, then he may have gone to prison. He may have lost his practicing license. He would have lost his patients and basically would have destroyed his life. And he saw no option but to take his own life. And that was a really sad consequence, but it wasn't the only example of how blackmail actually affected things. And the other consequence was the reality for a lot of men was physical violence. And I think probably the most egregious one was the killing of Alan Aberhart in 1964 when 6 teenagers assaulted him in Hagley Park and he died. Despite really strong evidence against those youths, a jury found them not guilty. And the jury decision has been regarded by our communities and others as a pretty egregious injustice ever since. Linda, do you want to talk about the situation for lesbians as well?
Well, sex between women was not illegal, so lesbians didn't face prosecution in that way. But we did share many of the same discriminations and punishments that gay men endured. Family attitudes and estrangement from families, discrimination in employment and loss of jobs, including dismissal from the armed forces and other places of employment, especially in the public service. Difficulty getting housing, punitive psychiatric treatment, teenage girls sent to girls' home. And for those women with children, the loss of their custody was very frequent. So these threats were all there. The 1961 Crimes Act that you mentioned included lesbians for the first time in penalising sex between women over 21 and girls under 16. Then it also introduced a new crime of keeping a place of homosexual resort. And this worried people on several levels because many young people, were setting up in group flats, and that kind of situation, they were worried that they could be vulnerable to further harassment from the police.
Yeah, it was also concerned to the pioneers of the Doreen Society. Now, the Doreen Society was the first formal homosexual club that was set up in 1962. They were worried about keeping a place of homosexual resort and whether that might expose their club, but they resolved that and they were never prosecuted in those terms. And a year later, they set up a legal subcommittee in 1963 to educate their members about the law and how to deal with the police, and also starting the process of how to change the law. And that led to the formation of the first public group to fight decriminalisation called the Homosexual Law Reform Society, formed in 1967. And its structure had a number of prominent legal, medical, psychiatric and religious people that gave professional credibility to the lobbying for law reform. And it was a very effective group at the time, but it did work on the view that there was a two-stage process, that you might accept 20 as the age of consent and then later on try and get equality. Linda, you were at university in the early 70s, I think, when gay liberation was formed in 1972. What do you recall of that, and how did they differ from the Homosexual Law Reform Society?
Well, I think there was kind of a general change happening. I certainly remember it from my time because of all the various liberation movements that were interacting at that time. And gay liberation was definitely a product of this and closely related to the women's liberation movement as well. So that first group in Auckland in 72 was followed soon after by groups throughout the country. And they had really strong ideas about lesbian and gay pride. One slogan was "Gay is good." That was really popular, and it kind of counters some of that stuff, we had in the period before that. They also focused on being out or open about being lesbian or gay. And speaking for ourselves was a really important aspect, not getting these other people to speak for us. They were very focused on decriminalisation as a part of a broader movement of gay liberation, and decriminalisation, of course, at an equal age of consent. And that sort of became a really important point at that time. Also, they challenged sexuality and sexual orientation as fixed and saw it as more diffuse, and said anyone could become gay or lesbian, and many did. And basically, they sort of challenged heterosexuality as the norm. And so this was kind of turning things around in I think, what was a really important way. Lesbian groups formed from 1973, influenced by both feminism and gay liberation, and were really firm on the importance of visibility and resisting compulsory heterosexuality. So then in 74, you have the Homosexual Law Reform Society and gay liberation and lesbian feminists coming together with the introduction of a bill by Gavin Young. And this was a bill to decriminalise homosexual acts between men with an age of consent of 21. So this was quite contentious, and the age was lobbied against by gay liberation and by lesbians. But actually the whole thing sort of got overtaken by an amendment put forward by another MP, Gerard Wall from Labour. And this amendment, which didn't go into Parliament but was his proposal, caused a huge furore because a draft amendment asked for a prison sentence of up to 2 years for anyone who says, writes or does anything to lead a person under 20 to believe homosexuality is normal. So this had so many hitches in it, and it caused an outcry from civil liberties, feminists, teachers, librarians, writers, publishers, even parents, liberal churches, all kinds of groups came out against this. And in the end, the whole then Young bill was defeated, and that was kind of like a defeat both for reform, but it did mean that Wall Amendment never happened as well. But that was pretty demoralising, and what you were kind of involved in the revival that happened after that, Gavin.
Yeah. Afterwards, there were a number of groups collapsed in 1975, but afterwards there was a second iteration of gay liberation and a much better organisation than had before. The National Gay Rights Coalition was formed in 1977, and that included most of the rainbow groups in the country, including trans groups. the National Gay Rights Coalition picked up on the principle of equality, and the first probably example of that was in 1979 when Labour MP Warren Friel was proposing a law reform bill, much the same as the Van Young bill with an age of consent of 20. The NGRC came out against it and he withdrew it. The following year, in 1980, he came back with an age of consent of 18, but again, it was opposed and he withdrew it. It was pretty controversial within our own communities at the time, but what it did is it reset the agenda for equality. And so the Homosexual Law Reform Society changed their constitution to one of more equality. And then we had the Equality Bill, which was drafted by a group of Auckland lawyers, and that in turn reinforced the idea of equality. The NGRC also made a submission to Parliament in 1977 advocating the inclusion of sexual orientation in what was the new Human Rights Commission bill at the time, but Parliament didn't accept that. And I might just say in 1977, at that same time, that was the year that Carmen stood for the Mayor of Wellington as well. So there was quite a bit happening. And then in 1979, the NGRC made a submission to the Human Rights Commission itself. It was asking for the Commission to recommend to the Prime Minister the inclusion of sexual orientation and decriminalisation of sex between men. That was rejected by the government, but also the Human Rights Commission didn't recommend the inclusion of sexual orientation. So during that time, there was also a number of examples submitted to the Commission on discrimination, including an issue with the Lesbian Centre not being able to advertise on the Wellington buses, rejected by the City Council, issues of child custody, particularly for lesbians, and issues of access to services in bars. And the Puss in Boots bar in Wellington was one example where people were denied service because of their sexual orientation. So although not successful, these initiatives did lay the foundation for equality in the criminal as well as protection from discrimination. So, Linda, what do you recall of our response?
Well, our response, which I know we both worked on, as it was a very strong lesbian response and a very strong response from the NGRC, because the Human Rights Commission's report came out like on almost Christmas Eve, a couple of days before Christmas, basically saying that some forms of discrimination should be legal. So this was kind of outrageous to be told that we should be discriminated against, not just not to get what we wanted, but to be told we should be discriminated against was incredibly anger-making. And we kind of mobilised, despite the fact it was the Christmas holidays, quite quickly. Had a press conference, had a Q&A at the Human Rights Commission where we went along at lunchtime to make our complaints of discrimination and to give examples of discrimination. And then and many other actions. But I think one of the things it did was it meant that among our communities, there was much stronger awareness of what human rights was, the need for human rights. So in a way, it helped to build the support for the anti-discrimination part of the bill that came in 1985.
Although a lot of that happened in Wellington because the head office of the Human Rights Commission was in Wellington, the Human Rights Commission had offices in other places and they too were targeted. So it wasn't just a Wellington thing, it was a national thing.
When we went along to do our Q&A to make complaints of discrimination, there was a lot of people there, and many of us, like who were working in the middle of Wellington in our work clothes, so just pretty ordinary, respectable-looking people. One of our activists, Tiggy Instone, was a really important highlight in the whole campaign, and she liked to come to some actions in one of her alter egos, which was called Cynthia Bagwash, and she dressed up in evening wear with a fox fur and spoke in a very upper-class sort of accent and was like somebody from many, many years before the 1980s. So she came to the Human Rights Commission, and at the time, the chief executive, which wouldn't have been the name of the office, but that kind of office, she was the only person he would talk to. So he would not talk to any of us that had organised the action and wanted to engage about the various forms of discrimination that we were facing. He just wanted to talk to this fictional character.
Because she looked normal.
In a fox fur. Gavin, how do you recall that Fran Wilde's bill got off the ground then in 1984-85?
Okay, well, in 1984, Prime Minister Muldoon called a snap election, and it was about a 3-week campaign. Fran and the Labour Party approached the gay community in Wellington, lesbian gay community, and asked for an election meeting in the Gay Community Centre. And that happened 1 week before the election in July 1984. And during that meeting, she agreed to introduce a bill to repeal the laws against sex between men and add sexual orientation to the Human Rights Commission Act. So that was followed up afterwards, obviously, and the bill then started to materialise. But what was also going on around that time that meeting was held was the early organisation of our communities around HIV/AIDS. And at that time, HIV/AIDS was a little bit like the early days of COVID, and people didn't understand it. They didn't understand how you caught it, who was to blame, where did it come from. And a lot of the early material was, it came through gay men, and gay men really got hammered over it. So we were fighting a defensive action, but also a positive reaction and trying to help people with HIV/AIDS, and also there was increased urgency to try and change the law, because if you think about it, the Ministry of Health wanted to help promote safe sex and give advice to homosexual men, but there was a law that said you can't have homosexual sex, so they were kind of breaking the law, and that was a real issue. So it gave extra urgency to the Homosexual Law Reform Bill.
That campaign was hoped, maybe expected, to be quite a short parliamentary campaign, because the bill covered decriminalisation of sex between men and put in some measures to include sexual orientation as a ground for discrimination to be outlawed under the Human Rights Commission Act. Many lesbians, though, were a bit sceptical about this plan for a short, sharp parliamentary campaign, because we'd attended the public consultation forums the government had run as part of setting up the new Ministry of Women's Affairs. And there had been quite an organised participation by fundamentalist Christian women coming in by bus to push the anti-lesbian and anti-abortion agenda, and to stack the workshops on those topics and some others as well. So we kind of felt that this would be an issue they would really want to get active on, the human rights and homosexual law reform, and also that they would see this as the beginning of further campaigns against women and other groups. But however, that input was not taken account of in the planning, and I think we were probably not as well prepared as we could have been for the introduction of the bill, which had to have some secrecy around it, so that there was not too much opposition involved. But as it happened, the opposition actually got going really quickly, a very rapid response, well-funded, and the Coalition of Concerned Citizens, led by Keith Hay of Keith Hay Homes Company, and Sir Peter Taylor, former Mayor of Napier, came as a real awakening to us when we saw how quickly the opposition had indeed mobilised.
Yeah, the CCC seized the initiative, and they organised some really big public meetings in the town halls in Auckland and Wellington and other places. And they also launched the petition against the bill with the aim of collecting 1 million signatures, which would make it the biggest petition ever, I think, in New Zealand. And they soon got the backing of the Salvation Army, who provided basically the legs to take it from door to door around the country. In America, the so-called moral majority, which was a group of conservative churches, they were big in Ronald Reagan's America, and the American religious interest in supporting the CCC in New Zealand to defeat the Homosexual Law Reform Bill led to them providing literature, arguments, and they sent out evangelical religious leaders to support the CCC. They did speaking tours and gave advice. Meanwhile, there were 4 MPs, Norman Jones, Graham Lee, Jeff Braybrook and Alan Warbank, who led the charge in Parliament and also fronted a lot of these public meetings. There were 2 campaigns. There was one outside Parliament and one inside Parliament, and we worked together. And we didn't always see eye to eye, but they were coordinated. And So, Linda, do you just want to talk about how our communities responded?
As I referred to earlier, we really had to call upon all of our experience over the years in different organising groups. It was a very diverse group of communities that made up the LGBTQI community or network. And so we just had to really quickly call on all our resources, and people did amazingly coming forward to do submissions, to do actions wherever they were. It might even be just a small action, but everything counted, I think, towards the broad campaign. And one of the areas that we chose was quite contentious with the MPs, but we decided that there was no way we could let the opposition get away with running public meetings, publicly advertised, against the bill without our attending them, in order to show ourselves and to make our opinions clear. And so we did that, and that led to very fiery meetings in Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, and some other regional centres. And those were tended to be on television. And I think one of the issues was that in the end, that closed the meetings down. They weren't able to continue because almost every meeting that was publicly advertised, there was a lesbian and gay presence at and some disruption. The other focus we took was on the Salvation Army because of them taking the petition around. Now, this petition turned up in people's workplaces, in schools, on your doorstep. They were going door to door knocking because they had the infrastructure. They basically every year ran a huge fundraising campaign, and they used that infrastructure to take the petition around. So it was really painful for many people to be confronted with this petition in all kinds of parts of their lives. We had a queue-in again at the Salvation Army office to ask for our donations back, because the donations that we had given to their Red Shield appeal was being used to fund the campaign against us. And complaints were made to the Salvation Army headquarters in London, and activists in other countries also protested. But also we found out, like in the Salvation Army, as in quite a few of the mainstream churches, there were pro-bill supporters there doing their best, but not able to make much difference to this huge campaign. And I think that's why we particularly targeted the Salvation Army, because this was a really big move against us. And they were totally unapologetic about it. They saw nothing wrong with what they were doing. At these opponents' meetings, the opponents were just obsessed. Well, in Parliament as well, weren't they?
Yeah.
Just obsessed with what gay men did in bed. You know, it was amazing. All these supposedly straight people going on and on about aspects of gay sex, acting like nobody but gay men was involved in anal intercourse, and also claiming constantly how many signatures they were getting. And their general kind of behaviour in public emboldened, especially like young guys in the opposition ranks, to abuse all of the supporters, in particular gay men and lesbians, and who got quite a lot of verbal and physical attacks. It would be really an increase in what happened normally, and also had to start doing self-defence courses to protect themselves. It's important to remember that this is a conscience vote. It was not a party bill, and therefore every MP, every electorate had to be one. MPs were meant to be voting with their conscience. And so we, the supporters, often had to organise these meetings in the electorate to show some support for the MPs. The other parallel that this brings up is the Springbok tour, which had happened just a few years earlier, which had completely split the country and split families, split, people at work, all sorts of division over the Springboks coming to play the All Blacks in New Zealand. And this very similar, in fact, sometimes even more personal stuff was happening, because obviously it was about the identities and the lives of people in families that they were hearing being criticised by their family members around dinner tables, and they were hearing insults at work and in the street. And so it was a really huge public campaign quite quickly. And I think that was really painful for a lot of people. I mean, there were a few positive aspects, because people did very bravely and courageously come out And sometimes in the end, family situations and work situations actually improved after good conversations. But it was a really painful, frightening time for a lot of gay men and lesbians.
Yeah, in May 1985, we sort of turned the campaign around to focus on a positive campaign really addressed at our people. So it featured rallies in Auckland and Wellington town halls that included a lot of humour, mocking of our opponents. The Top Twins performed, and there were speeches by Fran and activists. The week also featured social events and the launch of the Bigot Busters, and it culminated in Wellington in a street march on the Friday night. I would also say that just before that week, the Human Rights Commission had come out with support for the bill. So it was a complete reversal from where they had been in the early 80s, and that was support that was very much welcome. So just going back to the Bigot Busters, the Bigot Busters was based on a caricature of Norman Jones. He was the lead MP against the bill, and it became a theme for the rest of the campaign. So there was Bigot Busters events and so on, Bigot Busters marches. So we produced banners and sweatshirts, and there was even a song on the theme. The street march that I mentioned, we were worried about it, and I know Fran was as well, because it carried risk of us being attacked. At the time, street marches were quite a common way of demonstrating support for a cause, and many of our supporters until that time had no vehicle to support us or to show their support for us. So they came out in their thousands along with our own people. So it was a very big march, and it got a lot of positive media coverage. And I think it was a turning point in the campaign or the campaign outside Parliament, because for the first time we were able to show New Zealanders that we had large numbers of people in support of the bill.
Following that march, we also carried on providing a way for other groups that either we were part of or that wanted to support us to organise. And some activists, some of them based in Palmerston North and Wellington, they put together a coalition in support of the bill. And this was an opportunity for feminist organisations, unionists, liberal religious groups to support the bill. They held public meetings, and this was quite an important part of organising community support. People who'd supported us since the early days came and spoke, like the unionist and Māori activist Sid Jackson and the feminist activist Sonia Davies. People who had always been there, since the very early days, they turned up and spoke, which was fantastic. Another organisation was Heterosexuals Unafraid of Gays, HUG, which provided groups that supporters could belong to. That started in Auckland and then spread. And quite a few families of gay men and lesbians belonged to HUG. Then we decided to be more active with our international links. The NGRC and other groups had been part of the International Lesbian and Gay Association. And we decided to send Alison Laurie, one of the spokespeople for the Gay Task Force, to attend a meeting of the International Lesbian and Gay Association in Toronto, where she led a workshop on moral imperialism. People compared notes of what was happening in different countries with the religious right, and called for action. And then she went on to New York, where she was able to meet groups that had experience with some of the religious groups and some of the organisers from those groups that were sending advice and propaganda to New Zealand, and that had turned up in anti-gay publications. So that was really valuable. And the following week saw many activists in cities across Australia, Canada, the US, and in countries across Europe, picketing New Zealand embassies and consulates, as well as the Salvation Army. So Foreign Affairs had the opportunity to report back the protests to Wellington, adding further support for change. And also the International Lesbian and Gay Association sent Sylvia Boren, a New Zealand activist in Europe, to come here and present to the Select Committee. So it was kind of very useful and very heartening to have this international support, and also good for the MPs to see that it was there.
Yeah, I think you can see that that first 6 months of the bill, certainly the fight outside Parliament was really intense. And we're talking when we were preparing this, just saying I don't know how we had time to do it all, because there was huge numbers of things to do on every night, basically. But in September, there were marches in Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch in support of the bill. And that happened at a time when the last submissions were being taken by the Select Committee. And one of those last submissions was from Keith Hay and Sir Peter Tate, supported by the American evangelical pastor Lou Sheldon. So there was a very clear link with the Americans. The same week, an anti-bill, the anti-bill petition was presented at a huge rally on front of Parliament. It looked to us to have been influenced by a lot of American razzmatazz, and it really didn't fit comfortably with New Zealand's style of doing things. It featured young Christian men dressed in blue trousers and white shirts and carrying dozens of New Zealand flags, all lined up in a row. There were large boxes marked with the names of each electorate and supposedly containing the petition forms for that electorate, and young men and women carried each box one by one up to the bottom of the steps at Parliament and stacked them in front of the MPs who opposed the bill. Our people were kept behind barriers. We were certainly there in numbers to protest at what we thought was a pretty obscene sight. And we also knew at that stage there were a large number of irregularities with the petition. During that time, 24 of our people got arrested. I think Linda was one of them, weren't you? But the spectacle of the Coalition of Concerned Citizens' presentation of the petition was actually likened by the media and others to the 1930s Nuremberg rallies by Hitler. And so the prospect scared off Liberal MPs and the public, who could see that an organisation with a much wider agenda might be trying to wind back social change in New Zealand and using very un-New Zealand tactics. So, Linda, as I said, there were many irregularities in the petition. Do you want to just talk about those?
Yes, MPs and their staff and others went through all these boxes in order to have a look at the sheets of the petitions and did find many problems. There was many entries under names like Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, Marilyn Monroe. There were like pages of signatures all in one hand, so different names but the same writing. And there were also some misleading numbers in a box, like something that was meant to be from a particular electorate might turn out to actually not have anything from that electorate in it. It was all kind of an attempt to intimidate the MPs. Also, Fran Wilde was getting letters from people who had felt they had to sign, had felt they had no choice, couldn't say no whatever environment they were presented with the petition, and they were asking to be removed. So in general, the petition was pretty discredited, and the Petitions Committee in the end reported it back with no recommendation. So this meant it didn't proceed. The other thing that happened, which was quite devastating for everybody, and I think for many lesbians, was that the part of the bill that was going to add sexual orientation to the Human Rights Commission Act was clearly the least favoured part of the bill, the hardest to get support for, and in a way maybe some MPs thought they could support the part of the bill that decriminalised but not support the anti-discrimination measures. So when it was debated in the House, there was many amendments moved that actually meant it would have been useless. No one would have wanted such a, and in fact it would have been dangerous for the rest of the Human Rights Commission Act, I think too, because of the exemptions that had been passed. So in the end, Parliament voted against it proceeding, including quite a few supporters, and that was a loss, and I think it was many felt very upset about that loss. It took another 7 years before we were able to pass similar legislation.
Yeah. So the bill was debated every Wednesday night. So that was Wednesday night was set aside for private members' bills. And so it was every Wednesday Fran's bill was debated. It was vital for management of numbers because we needed to have the numbers there every night in Parliament in case there were amendments that were unfavourable or might have even disposed of the bill altogether. So that was really well done on the part of Fran and her colleagues. Parliament could have passed the bill at any time with an age consent of 18 or 20. There was plenty of support for that. But our opponents voted with the bill's supporters to defeat all of those amendments. So in the end, we ended up with the final vote being on an age consent of 16 or nothing. And our opponents thought that Parliament would go for nothing. They wouldn't support it, but they were wrong. And the bill passed by 49 votes to 44 on the 9th of July, 1986. So Linda, what do you think we learned from the whole thing?
Well, I think we certainly learned that it was really important to organise on our own behalf and to be as out as we could and to be as kind of proud about who we were as possible. And we also gathered a lot, I think, from working out ways to work together despite many divisions and many disagreements. And there were plenty of debates about, various tactics, various issues. But we were somehow able to work in support of getting at least the decriminalisation passed.
Yeah, and we also had visibility as part of a lot of other causes, including the anti-nuclear cause, women's rights, Maori land rights, anti-apartheid and the anti-Springbok tour protests. And that happened over many years. And so when we needed help, a lot of those people came as our supporters, and that really counted.
Our communities were really diverse.
Yeah.
And that showed in where all the support came from.
Linda, as I said at the beginning, we worked together very, very closely during the campaign. And it's actually been quite nice to do this and sort of brought up a lot of memories of the whole campaign and what we did.
Also that time in the 70s, I think, too.
Yeah.
The Freer Bill and the Human Rights Commission, because those were times when our organisations did work closely together.
Yeah, that's true.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Rights and Realities, Remembering 1986, brought to you by Te Kāhui Tika Tangata Human Rights Commission, produced by The Spinoff and Andre Afamasanga, recorded and edited by Matt Eller and Ricky Simmons at Evoke Audio, voiced and written by Leonie Kapia Hayden and Tane Polkinghorn. Special thanks to Gareth Watkins, Roger Smith, PrideNZ.com, Peter Noland, Linda Evans, and Gavin Young. If you would like to learn more about the rights of rainbow people, or if you have a complaint or question about discrimination because of your sexual orientation or gender identity, head to www.tikatangata.org.nz to find out how the Human Rights Commission can help. The views and recollections expressed in this recording are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Kāhui Tika Tangata Human Rights Commission.